welcome to the stage AFA Chairman of the Board, George Mullner.
Well, on behalf of the AFA, I'd like to welcome you all back. Our next presentation, and I think you already know this, is going to be on the state of the Air Force. Clearly, our presenter needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. General Mark Welsh is responsible for he's a senior military uniformed officer responsible for the organizing, training, equipping of 710,000 total force airmen around the world. I think most of you know that he came to his current assignment from being the commander of U.S. Air Force's Europe. In his current role, of course, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, he functions with his fellow service chiefs as the advisor to the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and then the President. He's a command pilot with 3,400 flying hours, and he's right behind me, so you don't have to welcome him to the stage. General Welsh.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time from your schedules to be here with us this week. To the Chairman, thank you again for hosting this great event. Thanks to all the AFA members, the chapter members who are here. Thanks to our international partners who have taken the time to be with us today. One of the things I've noticed in talking to my fellow air chiefs around the world here in the last few months is they're concerned that because of resource issues, we'll be pulling away from partnerships. And I think the smart money is on us going exactly the opposite direction. When you're having trouble with resources, when you really need to rely on partners, you hug them closer. You don't push them away. And so that's the approach we're going to be taking. Huck Carlisle in the Pacific, Frank Gorence in Europe are already all over that. Frank's spending a lot of time in Africa with the air chiefs there, developing a relationship. So we're excited about this, and we're excited about you being here to talk a little bit about our Air Force this week. I love the people on this slide. Old ones, young ones, it doesn't matter. I just love airmen. And that's what I want to talk about today. A little bit about airmen, a little bit about air power. But before we start, first slide, please. Let me add my sympathies to John Grainert, to Secretary Mabus, to every member of the United States Navy, and in particular to the folks assigned to the Navy Yard who were traumatized, injured, or killed yesterday, and of course to their families. Nobody expects to go to work and die. This is just wrong. But our heartfelt sympathies go from the United States Air Force to the United States Navy today. Next slide, please. By the way, it's been a pretty rugged year even before yesterday for our Air Force. We've lost some very courageous, very talented, and very engaged in the fight young airmen this year. We've also lost a couple of people who I consider to be legends of this business. There's a few of them I just want to walk through quickly and just say thanks to them. First, General David Jones, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, 300 bomber sorties in Korea in the B-29. Next slide. General Bob Rutherford, commander of U.S. Transportation Command, commander of Air Mobility Command, 110 combat sorties in the F-4 in Vietnam, 3 distinguished flying crosses. Next slide. Colonel Ruth Lucas, the first African-American woman promoted to colonel in our Air Force, and a leader in education and training for the Air Force during her entire career. She was promoted 06 in 1968, and all of us know what a time that was. A remarkable, remarkable American, a great lady, and a tremendously successful and professional Air Force officer. She was 92 when she died. Next slide. Colonel Ralph Parr, 641 combat sorties, flew the P-38 in World War II, flew the F-86 in Korea, a double ace with 10 kills. Pretty impressive guy. Silver Star, 10 distinguished flying crosses, and Ralph Parr had 41 air medals. Next slide. General Boots Blase, I had the pleasure of attending his funeral along with my wife Betty, and I had the chance to meet his wife Betty for the first time. I actually have a set of General Blase's colonel's rank. My dad pinned them on my shoulders when I was promoted. Boots Blessey was one of his heroes and a pretty good friend of his. This guy, of course, wore the Distinguished Service Cross. He wore 3 Silver Stars. He wore 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 21 Air Medals, also a double ace with 10 kills in Korea. Next slide. And most recently, Colonel Bud Day, the most highly decorated military warrior since Douglas MacArthur. 70 decorations, 52 of them for combat, including things like the Medal of Honor, the Air Force Cross, the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, 4 Purple Hearts, 3 Bronze Stars with Valor Devices, and the POW Medal. Just a remarkable, remarkable American. Next slide. Good news for us is that all our heroes aren't gone. Now, you might not recognize the chairman here. Back then, they knew him as Gorgeous George Muller. But you know, before he was this worldly, philosophical, nattily dressed chairman, he was a fighter pilot. Pretty darn good one. 750 combat sorties. 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses. 28 Air Medals. Test pilot, Test Squadron Commander, J-Stars Squadron Commander, and 1st J-Stars Combat Detachment, and a Fighter Wing Commander. George, thanks for who you were, not just who you are, buddy. Next slide, please. I bring this up because I love this slide. This is my dad on your right and my son John on your left. And this slide is really significant to me for a couple of reasons. Betty and I took this picture at John's graduation from Air Force pilot training. He had called my dad and asked him if he would come pin his rank on him. Dad had been a pilot in the Air Force for 35 years. Not his rank, but excuse me, pin his wings on him when he graduated. And Dad, of course, agreed. About 2 weeks later, John calls me and said, "Hey, Dad, you got to call your father and tell him to calm down. Well, he's buying a new service dress. He's buying a new ribbon rack." It had been almost 30 years since Dad retired. So I called Dad, and I tried to tell him, "Hey, you don't have to worry about spending all this money." And I mean, I got cut off. I got the literal hand on the phone. And he said, "Hey, buddy, those wings deserve my respect, and they're going to get them." So Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi, Betty and I took this picture of my dad pinning my son's wings on. Now, John's about 6'4". Dad used to be about 5'9". He was shrinking at this point in time, so John was kind of doing the knee bend to let him get the wings in there. I'm just not sure who was prouder in this picture. But I guarantee the 2 proudest people in the area were the ones behind the camera. This picture to me signifies an awful lot of things for our Air Force. It's the passing of legacy. It's the passing of heritage. It's the transition of responsibility between commanders, between generations, between organizations. This picture means a lot to me. My dad died a couple years after this picture was taken, and when he died, he left a note for my mom that said, "Hey, I got a safety deposit box, you need to go open it up." So we did, and there was a book in there. The book was titled The Croak Book, Things to Do When I Croak, authored by my father. And the first item in the book, item number 1, the only thing in there that was underlined said, "Bury me in my service dress." So we did, that service dress. And the night before the funeral, we saw him there lying in repose, and I couldn't help but think about what he'd done when he wore it. My dad, like the guys I just mentioned, fought in 3 wars. He retired with a little over 9,000 fighter hours. He also wore the Silver Star and 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses, more air medals than I can remember. He also had 5 major battle stars. He towed a glider across the beach at Normandy. He resupplied Patton's Third Army as they broke out of the bocage with airdrop. He flew a glider into Germany with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in the largest glider assault in history. And the last guy out of the glider threw him a rifle, and that was the first time Dad said he ever thought about how he got home. So he fought with the infantry for 5 months across northern Germany. And after that, he flew airplane after airplane, 19 of them total. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor in his last combat tour in Vietnam. he was a real deal. And I'm really, really proud of him. But he was really, really proud of you. And from the time I can walk, I remember him telling me about this. This pride thing is big to our Air Force, folks. It's what drives us. It's what causes these great people we bring in the door to become even greater performers. It's why we have 12 outstanding Airmen of the Year sitting here in this row that have separated themselves from their peers. They're not all that much more talented or that much smarter. They're just prouder. And so they work harder, and they commit themselves more, and they take care of everyone around them better. It's just who they are. You instilled that, by the way. Thank you for doing it. And I think they'll be proud, and I know I'll be proud of this video I'd like you to watch. If that doesn't fire you up, then you're not an airman. The A stands for air power. Don't you forget it. You know, the sad part about this is last night I put this thing on like late at night and was debating whether to even do this. And then I got distracted by something, and about 30 minutes later I realized I was still wearing it. Thanks, Nathan. Let me talk to you a little bit about the Air Force from my perspective, through the prism of my focus areas, which are these: win the fight, always first; strengthen the team, and shape the future. Next slide. We've been winning the fight for a long time, gang. This Air Force is an incredible success story, and it has been since the days of the Army Air Corps. You all know about all the things on this slide. Next slide. We've continued it since then. We have become the first option when diplomacy fails in several cases. Here's some examples of them. Next slide. And we haven't quit winning the fight. We're doing it every single day. This is just a layout of what we're doing around the world today. Not really surprising probably to you, but if you don't think about it every now and then, you kind of lose track of the volume of it. We got people all over the world 24/7 doing really important work. We're doing counterterrorism in 3 different combatant commands, AORs. We're doing ISR, space activities every single day, cyber in support of all the combatant commanders. We're doing mobility stuff all over the world, every 2 minutes, in fact, every hour, every day of the year. Now, all these kind of things are happening. Ed Rice has got 1,000 flights a day in the training enterprise. So when we start talking about resource limited, downsizing, all those kind of things, you got to step back every now and then and realize how big the enterprise still is. And don't panic too quickly. Next slide. Every day, 222,000 airmen are supporting our combatant commanders, directly supporting them, either stationed overseas, deployed overseas, or supporting them from home station. We've got 15,000 people doing space surveillance work, doing missile warning, 24/7, shifts around the clock, taking care of this nation, taking care of our combatant commanders. We've got over 100,000 people involved in that mobility enterprise I mentioned to you before. We've got 35,000 people who do the ISR enterprise, collecting, flying aircraft with sensors, monitoring space sensors, moving data and information across the architectures of the DCGS and getting it to where it needs to go so that data becomes usable information. We've got 53,000 people every day who do nothing but command and control. Contingency operations, humanitarian operations, standing defense plans in different combatant command theaters, ballistic missile defense, and then ISR activity around the world. And of course, in Central Command's AOR and Africa Command, we're actually doing combat operations. So this stuff is happening all the time. Your airmen are working hard, they're doing exceptionally well. That's where these 12 folks came from. That's why they're here, because they're unbelievably good at it. Next slide. We still do the same 5 core missions we started doing in 1947. We actually started before that, but we codified them in 1947 when the president gave us the order, and we're still doing them now in 3 domains, in airspace and cyberspace. And those domains are becoming more contested, they're becoming more congested, and we're having to figure out new ways of doing those missions in those domains. But that's what airmen do. We'll get better and better and better at this, but those missions aren't going away. So as we prioritize assets and resources for the future, that's where we'll focus. That's what the combatant commanders expect from us. Next slide. By the way, I'm getting really frustrated with hearing over and over again this comment about why do you need an Air Force? You've got to be kidding me. We're not past that yet? Here are the facts. That's how many people in each of the other services do anything related to aviation. From a mechanic to a weapons loader to an aircrew member. Those are the numbers. So let's let the Army do it. I don't think so. They're great at what they do. They're organic to Army maneuver units. That's what they do. The Marines can't do what we do. They're fantastically good at supporting the MAGTF. That's what they do. And they're really good at it, but they can't do what the Air Force does. The Navy is focused on the fleet. Fleet defense, near-term strike ashore. They can't do what the Air Force does. Not in the air, just like we can't do what they do at sea. These are great air arms. There is one Air Force in America, and you're it. So let's just shoot this one in the head. Next slide. If a combatant commander wants air power, there's only one number to call. And when I dial the phone, Showtime may answer. Showtime's an Air Force reservist at Elmendorf. He flies the F-22. He flies it really well. You guys see the news clip not long ago about the Iranian F-4s that intercepted a remotely piloted aircraft out over the Arabian Gulf? And then they were warned off? This is the guy who warned them off. After he rejoined on them, flew underneath their aircraft to check out their weapons load without them knowing he was there, and then pulled up on their left wing and then called them and said, "You really ought to go." Showtime is their superiority. It's still foundational to everything we do in the United States military. Without it, everything else has to change. We can't afford to forget that. Next slide. Megan Ripple sitting right over here. Megan, can you stand up for a minute? Let me tell you a little bit about Megan Ripple. Megan is an AC-130 gunship pilot. In fact, she was the first AC-130 female aircraft commander in the gunship community. Megan, please relax. You're making me nervous. Turn around and wave like this. I know you do it in your squadron. Go ahead. You can sit down for a minute. You don't have to clap for Megan. I'm going to bring her back up later. Megan's squadron, the 4th Special Operations Squadron at Horror last month came home from the desert for the first time since September of 2001. Thousands and thousands of combat sorties, combat hours, success on the battlefield over and over and over and over again. Megan herself has 2,500 combat hours. almost 360 combat sorties. She's been doing this essentially since 2001. She took a brief break to get back with her husband for 2 years and have a couple of kids, and now it's back to work. She's the ops officer of the 4th Special Operations Squadron now, and she deploys again in 2 months. This is how we're winning the fight. Not with the airplane, with Megan. Next slide. Maybe when they dial that airpower number, Zach Reiner is going to answer. Zach is only the 2nd Air Force Combat Controller to receive the Air Force Cross. That was back in 2008. He was held directly responsible and credited with saving his 10-man Special Operations team in a really brutal ambush as they tried to move into some mountainous terrain to go after one of the big kingpins in the region. Although he was wounded, he spent 3 hours calling in close air support and walked away from that with the respect of some very, very capable warriors and a nomination for the Air Force Cross, which he richly deserved. I got a chance to meet Zach here earlier this year here in D.C. when he was up at Bethesda in the hospital after being wounded again. Wounded pretty badly. He's now down at Fort Bragg. He's recovering. He'll be okay. He's hoping to get full mobility back. But this is one great young American who, as soon as he can, will be back in the fight. Because that's what he does. That's what Master Sergeant Payne does. He's a buddy of Zach's, and he's going to tell him you gave him a round of applause. By the way, when I first met Zach, he told me he knew Bill McRaven, the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. So I gave Bill a call, and I said, just wanted you to know, I saw Zach, he's doing pretty well. And Bill McRaven said, yeah, you know, every time for the last 10 years, anytime I went anywhere where the fighting was really ugly, I ran into Zach Reiner. I said, he's like a magnet. Nobody wants to travel with him anymore. but they all know him. Next slide. Trey Clark's an airman. An airman. He's also our cyber defense. He defends our networks. Right now, he's evaluated over 100,000 violations, penetrations, miscalculations, things that have gone wrong on our network to find out what the real problems are. He's identified several hundred and either streamlined them, quarantined them, or shipped them off to people who do ugly things to him. This is what he does. He is the most productive guy in his squadron as a young airman. This is how we fight the fight. Next slide. Brent Powell works in the 460th Space Wing for Willie Shelton. He works out of Buckley Field. In the last quarter, he saved $6 million just by reorienting sensors in space to collect intelligence in a different way. He did it. Senior Airman Powell. This is how we fight the fight. Next slide. These two guys are here too. Jeff and Tyler, you stand up for a minute? You guys can stay standing up because you look relaxed. I was out at F.E. Warren last year, and while we were visiting, Chief Cody was there with me, Betty and Athena were there, and we got a briefing on Global Strike Challenge, which is the big competition that Global Strike Command has on the nuclear business, missiles and bombers. And they gave us this briefing. We heard about Jeff and Tyler. Now, there are 4 trophies you can win in this competition. 3 of them are for missile teams, and one's for a command. You know, all the squadron teams kind of are totaled up, and then the group gets an overall grade. These guys won all 3 team trophies, and then, of course, led their group to win the 4th one. Their ops group swept everything. This is the best ICBM missile team in the world, right there. Thank you, guys. Thanks for winning the fight every day for us. You can sit down, guys. Thank you. Next slide. Bandage 3-3 is kind of a routine air medical evacuation flight in Afghanistan. That's the aircraft crew on the left. Interestingly, the guy on the right side of that photo on the left is named Ryan Thornton. He was my son John's roommate at the Air Force Academy. Small world, isn't it? The team on the right is actually the medical team that does the work and care for the patients and the wounded warriors in the back. And the mission director, next slide, please, is Adriana Valdez. Adriana, would you stand up, please? Adriana is an Air Force reservist. She's actually in her off time, she is a trauma nurse in the ICU at San Antonio Military Medical Center. She's been doing that a long time, and she's really good at it. Ryan Thornton, who, by the way, was a very, very good rugby player. Ryan Thornton is scared to death of Adriana, and he just calls her the badass. They had a mission not too long ago where they were asked to go divert into Mazar-i Sharif to pick up a wounded warrior. He'd been pretty badly injured, had a bullet wound to his upper leg. The femur had actually been, as it turned out, was damaged pretty badly. The nerve had been damaged badly. They didn't know that at the time. They'd done a brief surgery. Bandage 3-3 shows up, loads him on the airplane. They're on a regular run, and they think the patient's stable, so they're going to continue to the next spot to pick up another patient. Adriana and the team start working on this guy, and all of a sudden he starts to go downhill. All his vital signs start to get shaky. He starts to bleed. Entry and exit wound are both bleeding. She knows that he needs to get to Bagram like right now, or he's not going to survive this trip. She directs the pilot, get us to Bagram. They push the throttles up as far as they would go, and they start rocketing as fast as the C-130 can rocket to Bagram. The airplane is max performing. The medical team in the back is max performing, and the patient is still bleeding. It's about the time they get ready to go down into Bagram. Remember, there's mountains around the field. You have to come in high and then go down pretty steeply. They don't want to slow down. It's a little rugged inside the back of the airplane, and so they're bouncing around a little bit, and Adriana's having trouble now keeping pressure on the bleeding, which she's now doing with her hands, because that was the best way to try and do it. And so she straps herself in the litter with the patient and hangs on as they go down this bumpy ride, get him on the ground. She stays there, keeping pressure on the wound, trying to control the bleeding until they get him on an ambulance, start putting blood in him before they leave the airplane. She goes to the hospital with him. He survives, actually keep his leg, and she saved his life. I asked Adriana earlier if she'd ever managed to find out, who this was and talk to him later, and she said, no, I heard he got out of the hospital. Next slide. Adriana, let me introduce him to you. He's an Air Force hero. And he couldn't be here today, but he asked me to say thank you. I'll give you his email. Thanks for saving our guy. Thanks, folks. Next slide. A couple of things I am concerned about in this area win the fight. Number one is readiness. You guys know it's been slipping. We got to do everything we can to keep it as good as we can. Mike Hostage has been working his tail off along with Paul Selva on the mobility side to try and keep our CAF and MAF forces as ready as we can. We've been doing the same thing in the nuclear business. We've been doing the same thing in Korea. Everybody's doing everything they can to keep us as ready as we can be, but the longer this stuff stretches out, the longer continuing resolution goes next year. If we can encounter sequestration for another year or two, the worse it's going to get. We just have to keep our eyes open and understand that and minimize the impact where we can. It's not going to be good. Next slide. Full spectrum training is something that fell off the table for us about 6 or 7 years ago. We got to get it back on the table. Our job as an Air Force is to be ready to fight the high-end fight against a well-equipped, determined, well-trained foe. Don't know how big a force we'll have to do that, but whatever we have better be able to do that. At least some of it better be able to, and so that's where we're going. Next slide. So things like red flag, we can't keep canceling. We've got to figure out how to fund them. We need that training. Our partners need that training. We have other things like weapons school where we cancel a class. We'll never make that up. There will be that gap in our PhD warfighters for the rest of your group's career. We can't continue to allow that to happen. Our job is to fight and win the nation's wars. These are the PhDs in that business. We got to train them. Next slide. Strengthening the team. Next slide. You guys had a chance to hear the Secretary talk yesterday. Let me tell you something. He's pretty impressive when you hear him talk. He's pretty impressive when you first meet him. He's more impressive the longer you're around him. This guy's going to do great things for our Air Force, either as the acting or as the under when we finally get our new secretary confirmed, which I hope happens here pretty quickly. Her hearing is later this week. But Eric Fanning is a huge, huge plus for the United States Air Force, and the more you see him, the more you're going to like him. So please welcome him warmly as often as you can. Invite him out to see you, ask him questions, get him engaged. You're really going to like him. Next slide. Our Total Force Task Force has been working pretty hard, along with Sid Clark, J.J. Jackson, Frank Grass over in the National Guard Bureau, to try and figure out how we bring together this Air Force team and make sure that everything we do is focused on going forward together. We've had a couple of tags working very closely with us on the staff, Buddy Titshaw from Florida, who is here somewhere, and then Mike Edwards from Colorado. There you are, Buddy. Thank you, sir. And then Mike Edwards from Colorado, the tag there, has been working with us. And this group is going to come to a solution. We're going to come together with ideas that will help us move off of where we've been for the last 6 or 8 months and come to solutions that make sense for states and make sense for the nation. It's going to take us a little time to get all the analysis done because it's not easy. There's nothing easy about what we're trying to do here. But I think the idea of moving forward in a way that's constructive is really going to be helpful for us. Everybody's working this really hard. More to follow in a couple of months on this one as we get our POM input together for FY15. But I think we're going to find that my initial guidance to the team was to push as much into the reserve component as we can without impacting operational capability or responsiveness. Finding out where that is the trick. And it's different in every type mission system, and there won't be clear agreement in every case. So we're just going to have to grind our way through this. The key is that we do it openly, transparently, and with everybody at the discussion. So that's where we're headed. Next slide. Here's 3 things I think are important for us in strengthening the team from here moving forward. Number 1, we've got to make sure that common sense is the first standard we apply. We have hundreds and hundreds of AFIs in the Air Force, many of which haven't been rewritten in a long time. The world changes real quickly in this business. We've got a lot of frustrated people out of the front end of the Air Force who don't understand why they are given guidance to do things that don't make any sense to them. My answer to them is they shouldn't do it. Just quit. If it doesn't make common sense, if it doesn't make the mission better, if it doesn't take better care of our people, then just don't do it and tell your boss you're done. Now, you can imagine the looks I get when I say that to them. But I'm dead serious about this. All the MASCOM commanders are hearing it. They understand what I'm saying. They're trying to do the same things from their positions and their commands. And we're going to have to just go back to thinking about commanders being commanders, supervisors supervising, make decisions, and enable your airmen to do it. Our force is better educated than it's ever been. It's better trained than it's ever been. And we've got to empower our airmen better than they've ever been empowered. They're remarkably capable. I mean, just listen to some of the stories I was telling you. They're remarkably capable. And they don't feel empowered. They don't feel like they can make decisions or make suggestions because they don't think anybody will listen to them. We've got to change that. If we don't, we'll fail. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me stay here for just a second. Back up one. Communication, I'm referring here to corporate communication. This is my problem. I'm not doing a good enough job of getting information to the Air Force on issues that are important to them. We're trying, but it's not getting where we want it to go. It gets stuck in stovepipes, or it gets stuck in a base paper or on a website that not everybody's looking at. We're not waterfalling it enough to get it to everywhere. And we're desperate enough now, Chief Cody and I are now on Facebook and Twitter, which is terrifying. Follow us. But we got to fix this one because our airmen are smart and they want answers, and they deserve them. And then finally, we got to care more. And we already care a lot. But our job is to fight and win the nation's wars. If that's your job description, you'll never be good enough at it. And you should never pat yourself on the back. We got to get better every day. And the people we work beside are the greatest people on earth. Our families are the most wonderful people on earth. Why would we not want to care more about all of them and figure out how to show it and make sure they feel it? We got to do that, guys. We just have to. Let me give you just one example of a question I'm asking everybody as I wander around the Air Force. I basically ask them, if your best friend walked into your office today and sat down in the chair in the corner and they didn't say a word, even if you hadn't seen them in 3 or 5 years or something, do you think you could tell if they were having a bad day? Yeah, probably. You kind of know what they're thinking. It's a little bit intuitive to you. You know their body language. You'd know. If your young lieutenant or young airman was raped last night and comes into your office and sits down and doesn't say anything, can you tell they're having a bad day? The fact is, 84% of the time, we can't. Because 84% of the time, they don't report, and we never know it. Why is that? Why can't we tell? I don't know the answer. But if we can figure that out, we'll beat this thing. I'll tell you this, it's not a big Air Force program. It's one-on-one, it's airman to airman, it's supervisor to supervisee, it's commander to supervisor. It's what Chief Roy used to call analog leadership. It's Chief Cody walking into a room and saying, who's your best friend? Give me 90 seconds, I'll know more about him than you do. And challenging people with that. And then asking a series of questions and proving he can do it. Because we just don't take the time to ask. We got to care more. Next slide. Like this guy does. That's Sergeant Andre Davis is one of our 12 Outstanding Airmen of the Year. You heard his story last night if you were here. You've seen it in all the things that are published for this thing. Sergeant Davis, you stand up just for a second. He is actually an education training manager in a civil engineering squadron down in Virginia Beach, Virginia, in a Red Horse unit. You know what strikes me most about his record, and the reason I asked him if he would allow me to put his slide up today, is that he doesn't do anything spectacular. He does the normal stuff so spectacularly well that it becomes spectacular. He's the guy we all want working for us. He's the guy we all want to work for. That's why he's an Outstanding Airman of the Year, and he deserves it richly because he cares about everything. Thank you, Sergeant Davis, the way you do your job. Thanks for being a role model. Next slide, please. This is Jocelyn Alonzo there with Betty. Betty met her at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when we were out visiting General Wolfenbarger and her team. Senior Airman Alonzo started a group, actually helped start a group called Air Force Junior Support, AFJS. And the whole idea is give young airmen, and there's a lot of them at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, options other than going to bars and hanging out with people who like trouble. That's what it is. It's to teach people a different lifestyle from kind of the inside. It's to have them exposed to different groups of people who are more like them, who do things they like to do, whether it's snowboarding or going to church or whatever it is. And she arranges events, she arranges plays, she arranges, took a theater group downtown and teamed up with them to show a sexual assault play in the airmen's dorm, done by airmen, coached by the theater folks from downtown. She does all these kind of things over and over and over again, and she does it with that smile on her face and a commitment to help everybody she touches. She is an unbelievable young lady, and she's a senior airman in the United States Air Force. She strengthens the team every day when she shows up, and now she's going to spread it. You would not believe how many young airmen are doing this around our Air Force now. We saw groups like this on our trip to the Pacific last week. Hawk had told me we would, but we did. We saw them at Kadena, we saw them at Masawa, we saw them at Osan, we saw them at Kunsan. They're everywhere, just taking care of each other. It's really a positive trend. Next slide. Alicia Hines Warren is our Military Spouse of the Year this year. She's the first Air National Guard spouse to receive that honor, astonishingly, because we have some fantastic Air National Guard spouses. If you haven't met this lady, she's wandering around here this week. Stop her when you see the face and just talk to her for a minute, and your day will get better instantly. No kidding. She's got a magic to her. Meet her. Next slide. This part of strengthening the team is important. I want to particularly thank George for having the Family and Spouses Forum start up yesterday. That's a big deal. Even if it starts small and grows, it doesn't matter. It started. A lot of people have tried to do this in the past. It's hard to keep it going, but it is important for the airmen in our Air Force, especially the young ones, to understand that their priorities don't always lie with us. They can't afford to think that way. And so I tell them that on the day I die, when I'm lying on my deathbed trying to decide if I won or lost at the game of life, the fact that I was Chief of Staff of the Air Force won't even be part of the equation. If Betty is standing there holding my hand, I won. Our airmen need to understand that. They need to keep their priorities straight. They don't have to work 18 hours a day, and we shouldn't be making them. It's okay to have a life in this business. And if we want to keep our airmen longer, we need to make sure we express that to people. Next slide. And finally, and really importantly these days, let's talk about shape the future for a minute. Next slide. Put the vision out earlier this year, world's greatest Air Force, powered by airmen, fueled by innovation. We just followed that up, next slide, with a paper on global vigilance, global reach, and global power for America. The focus in this, the content is basically those 5 core missions and how they translate into vigilance, reach, and power for America. This document is actually an internally focused document. The intent is for all of our airmen, who we send it to directly, to understand where they fit in the broader scheme of the Air Force, because most of them know their piece really well, but they don't know a lot about the rest of it. They don't know how big the Air Force is, how many people do certain missions, where do they fit in all that, and that was the intent of this document. But the important document is the next one, slide. And it's whatever we end up calling our strategy, which we've been writing for a while. The Air Force 2023 effort, we had to figure out what force we could reasonably afford and expect to be able to build by 2023, given sequestration, was the start of the strategy build. And it's kind of been the outline of what we have to date. The idea here is we build the flight plan, we build the mini flight plans that go with it, the different kind of documents that have to attach to it, so we have resources connected to it, and then we start turning this ship and heading toward whatever that picture of 2023 looks like. We can't finalize the track until we know what our top line budgets are going to look like, so hopefully we'll get some stability soon. We don't have that yet, but we're going to have to make assumptions and get moving, because if we don't, we won't be able to turn fast enough to get there when the decisions are made. So we're moving out. Next slide. After that, of course, comes QDR. Steve Quast, Major General Steve Quast, is our QDR chief. He's going to be fantastic in this role. He's already fantastic in this role. We're hoping that QDR turns into a strategic discussion on where does the Defense Department need to go by 2023. What are the key parts of the Joint Warfighting Force that have to be in place? And then let's fund those. Let's have the debate about mobility versus submarine warfare, or amphibious assault capability versus infantry brigades. Whatever the debate needs to be, let's have it. And then let's invest in the priorities for the department in the right ratio, and let's get going. Next slide. You've heard a lot about sequestration. This is one of our sequestration hearings from earlier this year. Let me give you 3 areas that I'm concerned about with it, and a couple of them have just popped up. Next slide. I think you know we furloughed our civilian workforce. This is a breach of faith. For the last 3 years, we have not given pay raises to our civilian workforce, who are essential to every mission we have in the Air Force. And in some mission areas, they are the mission area. They're the whole thing. We were just down at ATC talking to the maintenance group. It's all Air Force civilians. So for 3 years, we can give them a pay raise, and then we furloughed them. And you know what they're saying to us when I'm visiting? They're not complaining about the furlough. They're upset by it, but they're not complaining about it. They're worried that they don't have enough time to get their job done, their work done by the end of the year. I mean, that's the caliber of people we've got. Corporately, the Air Force lost almost 8 million man days. I'm sorry, man hours, not man days. 8 million man hours from furlough. That's a huge hit. That's a lot of work that's not getting done. We have no plans to furlough in 2014, in case anybody was wondering. As long as the continuing resolution doesn't go past 6 months, I don't see any reason we would have to. We never had any plans to furlough in 2013 until all this started. The nation has got to come up with a better solution than this. And we've got to be part of that solution, and the Secretary and I are committed to be. Next slide. Another concern. One of the wings I just visited had been grounded since the 1st of April. The airplanes had been, the ones that weren't deployed. I met with a bunch of young airmen there. They had a lot of 1 and 2 stripers at this base. I asked one of them how he was doing, and he said, yeah, great. It's a great place. I really like it. You know, it's boring. And so I'll probably do my 4 and get out. I haven't heard anybody say life was boring in the Air Force for the last 12 years. But they're sitting around looking at airplanes on a ramp. They kind of got done with all the training they had to catch up. This guy works in the maintenance business, and he's bored as a 2-striper. That's a little scary. We got to think about this. Next slide. And we got to worry about retention. Expect the airlines to start hiring at the end of this year. Our rated force has options as they come out of their required period of service. They've served really proudly. They've served exceptionally well, and now they got choices to make. This is another issue. If we're not making them as good as they can be, if we're not challenging them, if we're not letting them train, if we're not letting them keep that edge, they'll walk. We just have to recognize that and do everything we can to make sure they do keep it. That's why they joined. They didn't join to sit and look out the window at their airplanes. Next slide. Here's the decisions we're making right now. These are the kind of things we're debating inside the building. Nothing's been decided for sure, but I'll tell you this, we're looking at everything because $1.3 trillion out of the Department of Defense budget is going to leave a bruise. We just all have to know that. Should we recapitalize, buy new, or should we modernize old equipment? This is not an easy decision. There's some things we can't modernize to keep it viable against the threat after 5 or 10 years from now. And so there's some places we have got to recapitalize. And that's going to take money away from the modernization effort, which has been hit by sequestration. We've got to look at whether we can use an airplane for a multi-mission versus single mission. As Mike Hostage points out to me, it's pretty much a false argument. I don't think we have any airplanes where we just do a single mission with them. But if there's airplanes that are better suited to multiple missions than another airplane, then the one that isn't is at risk. As we look at downsizing and saving money. We got to break the price curves, folks, in everything from services for our people, school costs, everything we do at a base, all the way to airplane costs. 1945, a really good airplane cost $500,000. 30 years later, 1975, it cost $5 million. 30 years later, in 2005, it cost $100 million. We can't stay on that curve. In fact, the Air Force is off of it now. The nation's off of it. We can't afford it. We need your help to figure out different approaches. And I'm looking forward to talking to the leaders of industry about this. We've got to come up with a different approach. And then the Air Force organization, with all this going on, we're taking a hard look here, starting at the next corona at how should we be organized? Do we have it right? Do we need to adjust? What do we need to adjust? If you've heard rumors about all the changes, they're rumors. We haven't made any decisions. We haven't even had a real conversation about it yet. But it's coming. What do we do with cyber, space, ISR? Do we combine them, split them? What do you do with the nuke enterprise? Do you make it bigger? Do you make it smaller? Do you put it under something? Do you keep it independent? All those things are going to be debated. A lot of people have opinions. We'll make decisions and we'll move on. And we'll let you know what we're doing. Next slide. Here's things we have already decided. We're going to prioritize 3 programs for recapitalization. KC-46, we have to recapitalize the tanker fleet. After the last one's delivered, we'll have 200 plus tankers that are 65 years old. We just have to recapitalize this fleet. Next slide. F-35, we have no other choice. The airplane's doing well. For the last couple of years, it's actually performed solidly on track. We're going to get there by IOC. I'm confident of it. And I'm not being Pollyanna. I'm confident we're going to get there, assuming we have consistent funding between now and then. The issue with F-35 is if you don't have it, you can't operate in the advanced air defense systems of the future. You can't do it. And you can't compete with a 5th generation aircraft unless you have a 5th generation aircraft. It's that simple. You can't dress up an old one and make it a new one. You can make it better, but you can't make it this. Next slide. You wonder why I'm showing a Shape the Future slide with a B-52 in it in 1962? Can you see the guy on the left there, the number 40 right behind his head? You can't see the 10 that's in front of it. Next slide. Maybe you can see it now. This is the same airplane. Long-range strike bomber is another mandatory recapitalization program for us. We don't have an option. Operationally, we have to have it to do what I described before, be ready to fight a determined, well-armed, well-trained enemy in a high-end fight. Next slide. A lot of you have been asking me how we are on this program. I can't talk about this. Next slide. The one thing I will tell you we will be doing a lot of in the future and talking about, though, is how do we shape this force? And we're going to have help from some pretty remarkable people, like we always have. And one of them is sitting right there, and most of you know her, Miss Natalie Crawford. Would you stand up and wave to the crowd, Natalie? Got a little helmet head there, miss. For a long time now, Natalie Crawford has been part of our Air Force. You know she's worked for RAND for a long period, but during that whole time, she's been in love with the Air Force and with airmen and with their families. And she has done everything in her power to make this a better organization, to make us better equipped, better qualified. She knows more about the Air Force, about the technology that we use, and about the technology we could use or should use than anybody in this room, I suspect. She's brilliant. And she cares more than any 10 people I know. Natalie, I just want to say thank you for a lifetime of being a great airman. And thanks for the help I know you're going to be as we try and figure this out for the next couple of years. I'm going to be leaning on you, and so will many of these others. Thank you for your service. Next slide, please. So, sounds happy, doesn't it? You worried about the future? I get this question a lot. The answer is no. I'm excited about the future. It's a great time to lead in our Air Force, at whatever level you're at. We've got some things we got to figure out. We'll figure it out. You can talk to these guys yet? They can figure anything out as long as we don't get rid of them. So we got to be worthy of them staying. We do that, we win. We keep these guys on the job, the mission will get taken care of. We just got to figure out how to get them the tools they need to get the job done. And we can do that. There's another reason I don't worry about the Air Force. It has nothing to do with technology. It has nothing to do with their talent. It has to do with their heart. I'm going to show you another clip here. This is kind of put together with a couple of pieces of film from the recent series Inside Combat Rescue. The guy on the tape is a young Air Force pararescueman named Justin. He's on his first combat tour. It's a short clip. Enjoy it.
It is Sunday, 3 days before I leave to Kandahar City. This is my daughter. Monique is gonna turn 2 June 28th. It's tough leaving my family behind. Not knowing if I'll come home to provide for them. The strength that I rely on when I'm deployed, first of all, comes from my family. I represent a little girl named Monique Sophia, and I must conduct myself in a way that would make her proud that I'm her father.
Alpha. Child.
Scramble, scramble, scramble.
Hey, let's go. Get the blood, get the med bags. It's a baby.
Local national child has a gunshot wound to the head.
The child desperately needs hypertonic saline, a solution that will ease the pressure on his brain. Justin has to get an IV line into the boy's arm now. But the IV isn't working.
Save the line! We're gonna do an IO!
An IO penetrates the bone instead of a vein. It's effective, but incredibly painful.
I'll never forget the look of pain on that child's face. I bet you that boy never fired a shot in anger against an American or even a Taliban. Yet he ended up in the back of my helicopter. I'll never forget that face.
You know, that I went down to the hospital and, they told me he made a full recovery.
Awesome. That's a lot. That's a weight off my mind.
I'll never worry. Not while these guys are on our side. Would you guys come up and join me? Come on, Natalie. just stay right. We'll just stay right here.
The old lady in the
You're good. Guys, just come up here and line up on either side of us here. You can't hide, buddy. This is your Air Force. Next slide. This is what they stand for. Next slide. The heritage we share is a gift, given by those who've gone before and magnified by those we stand beside. Leadership is also a gift. It's given by those who follow, and we have to be worthy of it. That's our job. And when we are worthy of it, then those who follow us stand a little prouder. My name is Mark Welsh. I'm an airman, just like you. Air power, because without it, you do lose. Thank you, folks. Thank you, guys. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Alan. Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. Thanks, guys. Hang around. We'll do a photo afterwards. Okay.
Well, Chief, on behalf of the AFA, I'd certainly like to thank you for this great presentation. You know, yesterday, Secretary Fanning said that one of the things that he's learned in his 5 months on board was never to follow one of your presentations. And I think everybody in this room now understands why. We've got a small presenter, legal, the GC staff is clear. It's a series of foundational documents on air power, and it's written by Hap Arnold and Ira Aker.
Very cool. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, buddy. Thank you very, very much. Thanks, folks. Very cool.
Well, I'd ask you all to check your programs for the next speaker in this room, and that'll be in about 15 minutes. Thank you.